No, please, not again. The Shackled Bride of Bitter Creek. Before we start the story, leave a comment telling us which city you're watching from. And at the end, don't forget to rate this story from 0 to 10. Enjoy the story. Autumn of 1881 carried a sharp bite in the Montana Territory. The mountain town of Duskwood lay beneath a sky the color of frosted steel, its streets swept by winds that carried the scent of pine and wood smoke. Leaves scraped across the courthouse steps like brittle whispers of things better left unsaid. On those steps a crowd gathered, not large, but heavy with expectation. Boots shuffled shawls, tightened eyes darted to the auctioneer's stand. A wooden sign creaked above the platform, its hinges rusted from years of weather. Beside it, a man adjusted the collar of his brown coat and stepped forward. His name was Samuel Holt, a blacksmith who carried himself with the quiet weight of someone used to labor, not to spectacles. The auctioneer cleared his throat voice, cracking like it hadn't been used in weeks. Next lot, the cabin and 12 acres on Bitter Creek Road. Includes a well and corral. Opening bid, 50 cents. Silence spread across the crowd like oil. Not the silence of disinterest, but of dread. Men glanced at one another. Women pulled their shawls tighter. Samuel raised one gloved hand. 50 cents. He waited for the counterbid that never came. The auctioneer's eyes shifted uneasily, scanning the faces of townsfolk who suddenly found the ground or the sky fascinating. No one would meet Samuel's gaze. The air felt thick, as if the entire town carried knowledge too heavy to speak. Going once, the auctioneer said, his voice hesitant. At the back, a tall rancher muttered something under his breath. The woman beside him shook her head sharply as though silencing him. Going twice, an old woman, Martha Blaine, everyone knew her, stepped closer, tugging her shawl against the wind. She leaned toward Samuel, her eyes milky with age but sharp with warning. "You don't want that place, son," she whispered. "Trust me." Before he could ask, the gavel cracked against the wood like a rifle shot. "Sold to the gentleman in the brown coat." The words carried no triumph, no satisfaction, only resignation. The crowd broke apart too quickly, too quietly. Samuel accepted the folded deed from the auctioneer, whose hand trembled like a man passing a curse. "Is there something I should know?" Samuel asked. The auctioneer gave a curt nod and turned away without a word. Within minutes, the square emptied. Samuel stood alone, deed in hand, with the feeling he had just stepped into a story the rest of the town already knew too well. The trail to Bitter Creek twisted through pines that whispered with every gust, like voices searching for a listener. Branches clawed at Samuel's coat roots, pulled at his boots, and an old fence, half fallen, leaned against the earth like it wanted to confess. A rusted sign swung on bent nails. Whitmore letters faded, but still legible. At the clearing's edge, Samuel stopped. The cabin squatted against the land, hunched and weary, its log walls darkened by rain and time. The roof sagged shingles missing like teeth from an old man's mouth. Yet the corral, though overgrown with weeds, stood firm. The well still held shape. For 50 cents it was more than a bargain. He dismounted and approached. Inside, the air was thick with dust, the kind that coated the lungs as much as the walls. Silence hung in the corners like cobwebs. Samuel moved slowly, tapping floorboards with his boot, noting where they groaned. Then he heard it. A faint rustle, too deliberate for wind, too quiet for an animal. It came from the barn just beyond. Samuel pushed the warped barn door open, its hinges groaning in protest. Sunlight slipped through cracked slats, falling across heaps of yellowed hay. The smell struck him old straw, yes, but beneath it something sharper. Human, bitter with sweat and fear. The rustle again. He stepped forward, parting the hay with his boot. Something moved beneath. He dropped to his knees, hands shoving straw aside until his fingers brushed flesh. A cry broke the silence, a woman's voice, hoarse, raw. There, shackled by the ankle to a post, lay a figure half hidden in filth. Her body was thin, her hair tangled with straw, her wrists bruised. She recoiled from the light hands raised as if to ward off a blow. "No, no, please, not again," she gasped, her voice ragged like it hadn't been used in years. Samuel froze. He lifted both hands slowly, palms open. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said, his voice steady. She shook her head wildly, curling into herself, eyes darting toward the door. "You're not him. You're not the new one." "I don't know who you mean," Samuel said softly, edging closer without touching. "But I'll get you out of this." She flinched as he pulled a tool from his boot and worked at the rusted lock. The metal scraped her breath, came in short gasps. "Easy," he murmured. "I'm not putting you back in chains." After minutes that stretched like hours, the lock gave with a reluctant click. The shackle clattered to the floor. The woman whimpered, sagging against the wall, her body trembling. Samuel slipped his coat from his shoulders and wrapped it around her frail frame. She tried to rise, faltered, and without asking he lifted her into his arms. Her weight was nothing yet, carried the heaviness of years stolen. He stepped into the fading light boots, crunching over dead leaves, the cabin silent behind them. Not a word passed between them on the walk back, but one sound was gone forever, the dragging of chains. That night, the fire in Samuel's cabin burned low, its crackle the only sound against the mountain wind. The woman lay wrapped in wool blankets on his cot, her breath shallow her body, a shadow of survival. Samuel sat nearby, silent, staring into the flames. He didn't know her name. He didn't know her story. But he knew one thing with the certainty of forged steel: someone had hidden her away like an object, and fate had placed her in his path. And for the first time in years, she was no longer chained. The fire burned steady through the night, though Samuel barely closed his eyes. Every shift of the blankets, every faint sigh from the cot drew his attention. The woman slept fitfully, her body flinching at dreams that sounded more like memories. Samuel stayed at a distance, giving her space, his broad frame hunched in a wooden chair. By morning, pale light crept through the cracks in the shutters. Samuel stirred the coals, poured water into a pot, and set it to boil. He moved deliberately, as though even the scrape of iron on wood might startle her. When her eyes opened wide and frantic, he froze where he stood. Her gaze darted to the corners of the cabin, the door, the single window. Then her breath slowed, and she focused on him. "You're not them," she whispered. "No," Samuel said softly, hands open at his sides. "Name's Samuel Holt. Blacksmith. That's all." She pulled the blanket closer, her fingers trembling. Her lips moved, then faltered as if giving away her name might cost too much. Finally, she whispered, "Clara." "Clara Whitmore." Samuel gave a small nod. "Clara," he repeated like the sound itself was a promise to remember. He ladled hot water into a tin cup and set it on the table within her reach. "Drink, if you're able." Clara hesitated, then crawled closer. She gripped the cup in both hands, spilling half before it touched her lips. She drank greedily, her eyes never leaving his face, watching for the catch, the demand that always followed a kindness. But no demand came. Samuel turned back to the stove, stirring a pot of oats in silence. The days that followed were stitched together with small acts. Clara's body was fragile, her wrists raw, her shoulders bent as if years of chains had trained her posture to fold inward. Yet, with each sunrise she tried. The first morning, she insisted on standing, though her legs wobbled beneath her. She moved across the cabin, leaning on the table, steadying herself with determination. She found a shirt of Samuel's with a ripped cuff and asked for thread. Her stitches were clumsy, uneven, but she kept at it, muttering under her breath. Better than nothing. Samuel watched without comment, though he noticed how she bit her lip in concentration, how the furrow of her brow softened when she tied the final knot. "Good as new," he said simply. The next day, she swept the floor with slow, dragging strokes. Dust rose in thin clouds, settling in her hair, but she did not stop. She boiled water, clumsily, chopped vegetables, read from a tattered book Samuel kept in a trunk, her voice halting rusty but growing steadier. Each act was more than a task. Each was a declaration, "I am still here. I am still someone." Samuel saw it. He saw the way she folded the dishcloth neatly, the way she flinched less when the door opened, the way her shoulders straightened when she sat by the fire. He didn't speak of it, but he carried each detail like iron in his chest. But Duskwood carried whispers faster than wind. By the end of the week, townsfolk knew Samuel Holt was no longer living alone. He had brought a woman into his cabin, thin as a reed, pale as a ghost. She was no wife too frightened to be kin, too haunted to be a boarder. The rumors spread like smoke. Some said she was a runaway bride. Others claimed she'd been kept for pleasure and had grown to like it. A few muttered that she was cursed, that anyone who housed her would meet ruin. Clara heard them all, though no one spoke to her directly. She heard it in the shopkeeper's clipped tone when Samuel paid for flour in the preacher's wife's sidelong glare, as she pulled her child away in the heavy silence that followed her steps across the wooden boardwalk. So Clara stopped going into town. Instead, she kept to the cabin and the forge. She cooked, cleaned, and read the old journals Samuel had saved. She fed the fire in the hearth while Samuel hammered steel in the yard. But Samuel noticed the way her eyes dulled when she looked out the window, the way her hands clenched a dishcloth until her knuckles whitened. One morning he found her frozen at the sink, the cloth twisted in her grip. Her voice was rough when she asked, "What are they saying?" Samuel didn't look up from the horseshoe he was shaping. "Doesn't matter. It does to me." He set the iron down, wiped his hands. His eyes held hers steady and unflinching. "They're cowards, Clara. Same ones who looked away when your family disappeared. Same ones who let Ralston rise without asking why." Her lips pressed tight, but she said nothing more. That afternoon, Samuel asked her to walk into town with him to fetch nails and kerosene. Clara hesitated, then nodded. They walked side by side down the main street. Heads turned. A woman on the saloon porch leaned in, whispered to her friend, and laughter followed. Clara lowered her eyes, clutching the basket against her chest. Then a voice rang out sharp mocking. "Well, I'll be." Samuel Holt finally found himself astray. The street stilled. A ranch hand leaned against a post outside the saloon, broad shoulders blocking the sun. His name was Tom Booker, and he grinned as though cruelty were sport. "Ain't she the one locked up in that old barn? Ralston's little mistake?" Clara's fingers tightened on the basket, her face flushing. She turned away. Before Booker could spit another word, Samuel moved. His fist connected with Booker's mouth, the crack echoing down the street. Booker staggered, then lunged. They crashed into the dust fists flying. Samuel's cheek split open, blood dripping, but he didn't stop until he had Booker pinned, fist raised. Clara's voice cut through the chaos. He froze, breathing hard. The crowd had gathered, men on porches, women clutching children. Even the deputy stood uncertain, his hand hovering over his gun. Slowly, Samuel released Booker, rose to his feet, his knuckles bloodied. He faced the crowd, voice low but steady. She's more woman than any of you cowards." Silence followed, heavy and unbroken. Samuel took the basket from Clara's trembling hands. "Come on," he said gently. "We're done here." They walked away side by side. No one dared speak. That night, Clara tended his wounds with hands that shook less than she expected. She dabbed at the cut on his brow, her touch careful. "Why did you fight him?" she asked quietly. Samuel met her eyes steady as ever. "Because no one else ever did for you." Clara's breath caught. For the first time in years, she looked at a man and saw not demand, not cruelty, but defense without price. She didn't understand it. Not yet. But something in her chest loosened as though a chain had shifted. And for the first time, she believed Samuel Holt might be the one person in Duskwood who wanted nothing from her except for her to live free. The morning after the fight, the air in Duskwood felt heavy, like the whole town had inhaled but refused to exhale. Samuel rose before dawn as always, but Clara sensed something different in his movements, more deliberate, more guarded. He saddled the horse with quiet care, his eyes often flicking toward the cabin toward her. When he left for town, Clara stayed behind. She moved through the single-room cabin with a kind of restless energy, as though the walls themselves whispered reminders of where she had once been chained. She swept the hearth, folded the wool blankets, and poured water into a basin to wash. Yet her eyes kept returning to the same spot of floorboard near the back wall, just slightly raised, misaligned from the rest. At first, she told herself she was imagining it. But as the morning stretched on, curiosity pulled stronger. She knelt, fingers brushing along the edge. The wood felt different, older, warmer somehow. Her eyes caught a bent nail near the bed frame. She worked it loose, prying carefully. The floorboard groaned, then gave way. Beneath it, wrapped in a ragged cloth, lay a leather-bound journal and a tightly rolled map. Dust clung to them like secrets. Clara's heart hammered as she unrolled the map. It was her family's property, Whitmore Ranch, marked in neat black ink, its borders clear and proud. But another set of lines had been drawn over it in red, overlapping, consuming. And beside it, a name she knew too well, Edward Ralston. Her breath caught. Her trembling hands opened the journal, and she recognized the handwriting instantly. It was her own. Pages she had written in the weeks before her disappearance. She read her voice a whisper. "He says he loves me. Says we'll marry in spring. But he wants the land signed over first. Mama's been sick. The maid is gone. I don't know who to trust." Her fingers flipped faster. Another entry. "Today, a doctor I never met came to the house. Said I was hysterical, needed rest. But I never asked for him. Edward said he'd handle everything. He forged Mama's signature. He's selling parcels. My land. I'm scared." The words blurred as tears filled her eyes. She remembered hiding the journal, desperate for anyone to know the truth if she vanished. Now, years later, here it was, her own voice reaching back through time, proving she hadn't been mad, proving she hadn't been mistaken. She pressed the journal to her chest, her whole body trembling. Edward Ralston hadn't just betrayed her. He had erased her. Samuel returned before noon to find her sitting on the floor, the journal spread open across her lap, the map beside her. He crouched, picking up a page. His jaw tightened as his eyes scanned the handwriting. "I found everything," Clara whispered. "He lied. He forged the deeds, had me declared insane, stole the land, hid the doctor, sold off everything my father left." Samuel's face hardened, his hands closing into fists. "Then the whole town's been living off his theft." Before he could say more, a sound cracked through the air, a gunshot. Bark splintered above Clara's head. Samuel lunged, pulling her down behind the water trough outside the cabin. He drew his revolver, eyes scanning the tree line. Another shadow shifted between the pines. Samuel fired the shot, echoing, but the rider turned and bolted horse, galloping hard up the ridge. Silence returned, sharp and unnatural. Clara's breath came in shallow bursts. Someone's watching. Someone knows what I found. Samuel stood slowly scanning the fresh tracks in the dirt. He returned with fury in his eyes, his face carved from stone. "They've been watching a long time," he said. That night, they sat by the forge fire. Samuel worked silently on a broken horseshoe, the rasp of steel on steel a steady rhythm. Clara sat across from him, knees pulled to her chest, wrapped in one of his old coats. The journal rested in a tin box under the floorboards, locked and guarded by Samuel's rifle. Clara stared into the flames, her voice soft but trembling. "I was 20 when it began. Springtime. I'd just learned enough from my father's ledgers to notice the deeds had changed. Mama was coughing blood. A doctor I didn't know visited once, and after that she only worsened. The maid vanished. I told Edward I'd take the deeds to the magistrate. The next day they said I'd run off with a stable boy. The papers printed it. Her laugh was bitter, her eyes glassy. They didn't just lock me away, Samuel. They erased me." Samuel set down the horseshoe. Slowly, he reached across the fire and held out a clean cloth. "Your hand." Clara looked down. She hadn't even noticed the thin cut across her palm. She hesitated, then gave him her hand. His was warm, calloused, steady. He dipped the cloth in warm water, cleaned the wound with care. She winced, but didn't pull away. "You're not gone," Samuel said quietly. "Not to me." Her throat tightened. "Every man who's touched me the last 3 years carried keys on his belt. Except you." He didn't flinch. "Then let this be different." The firelight flickered in her eyes, and suddenly the dam inside her broke. Tears slid silently down her cheeks. Her other hand rose and covered his trembling. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I don't know why I'm crying." "You don't have to be sorry for bleeding," Samuel said. "Not here." For a long while she cried quietly, fiercely, while he held her hand steady across the fire. Later, as the flames died low, Samuel spoke. "We'll take the journal to the sheriff." Clara's head snapped up. "No, you can't." "Why not? He needs to know." Her voice dropped urgent. "He works for Ralston. They all do. You bring this in and it disappears before the ink dries. And so do we." Samuel fell silent, staring at the journal. His jaw tightened. "Then, what do we do?" Clara hesitated. Then her voice steadied. "We make him come to us." Samuel studied her, the iron in her tone. Slowly, he nodded. For the first time since he had found her beneath the hay, Clara Whitmore wasn't just surviving. She was preparing to fight. 2 days later, a notice appeared on the town's message board. The handwriting was Samuel's, careful and plain. "Cabin for sale. 12 acres. Water access. Quiet. Inquire at town hall." It was bait, and they both knew it. From a distance, Clara watched as Edward Ralston's assistant read the note. Within an hour, the mayor himself knew. By sundown, 2 strangers were seen riding toward the mountain trail. That night, Clara lay awake on Samuel's cot, listening to the howl of wolves far off in the hills. Samuel sat by the forge fire, cleaning his revolver. His jaw clenched. Neither spoke much, but both knew what they waited for. The fire came after midnight. Samuel woke to the smell of smoke, heart hammering. He threw open the door and saw the glow rising beyond the ridge, the old Whitmore cabin already half consumed by flames. "No," he muttered, and without hesitation he mounted his horse and rode hard. The cabin roared like a beast fire, leaping from window to window roof, collapsing inward. Smoke seared Samuel's lungs as he forced his way inside. He coughed, eyes burning, but he reached the hearth, kicked open the loose floorboard, and snatched the tin box from its hiding place. Flames licked his sleeves as he turned, staggering through choking smoke. A beam cracked overhead and fell, striking his shoulder, driving him to his knees. He clutched the box tighter, teeth gritted, and forced himself through the doorway. By the time he stumbled into the night air, the box, cradled in his arm, the cabin collapsed behind him. At dawn, Clara found him slumped by the forge, soot-blackened arm bleeding, clutching the charred box like an infant. "You damn fool," she whispered, wiping ash from his forehead. He gave her a faint smile. "Got what we need." 3 days later, the town gathered in the courthouse for the autumn auction. Edward Ralston presided, as always immaculate in his tailored coat, his smile a politician's mask. He spoke confidently, his gavel cracking like thunder. Then the doors opened. Gasps rippled through the crowd as Clara Whitmore walked inside. She wore a faded blue dress, her bruises hidden beneath sleeves, her hair pinned back the way it once had been. Her voice, when it came, was steady and clear. "My name is Clara Whitmore," she said, stepping onto the floor, "and the land you auction belongs to me." The mayor froze, his eyes widening. From the back, Samuel, arm bound in a sling, face still bruised, watched his heart pounding. Clara lifted the journal. "This contains letters, deeds, and records proving Mayor Edward Ralston falsified ownership of the Whitmore estate, that he locked me away under false claims of insanity, that he murdered my mother and stole what was ours." Gasps turned to shouts. A man near the window rose furious. "You've got no proof." "I do." Clara held up a page bearing the mayor's personal seal, his signature forged, his letters filled with lies. Ralston descended the podium, his composure cracking. "You ungrateful little." His hand went to his coat. "Gun," someone cried. The pistol flashed. Clara froze, heart thundering. Samuel moved before he thought. He lunged from the crowd, shoving her aside. The gunshot echoed, and Samuel staggered, blood blooming across his shoulder. Screams filled the courthouse. Men wrestled Ralston to the ground, the pistol clattering across the floor. The sheriff at last drew his weapon, shouting for order. Clara dropped to her knees beside Samuel. Her hands pressed desperately against the wound. "You idiot," she whispered, voice breaking. "Why did you do that?" His voice was a rasp but steady. "Because I'd do it again." The doctor said the bullet had passed clean through, but Samuel had lost too much blood. For 2 days, Clara never left his side. She sponged his forehead, read quietly from the paper, changed the bandages with trembling hands. Each time his breath hitched, her own stopped. Each time he stirred and whispered her name, she touched his hand and whispered back, "I'm here." On the third night, lantern light cast soft gold across the room. Samuel's eyes fluttered open. He focused on her, faint but clear. "You stayed," he murmured. Tears blurred her vision. "Of course I did. I thought you'd run." Her lips trembled. "I thought I would too. I always ran from pain, from fear, but then I finally had someone worth staying for." Their eyes met. Samuel reached up with his good hand, calloused fingers brushing a tear from her cheek. Their lips met, hesitant at first, then sure. It wasn't a kiss of rescue, it was a kiss of recognition. The trial reopened within the week. Clara stood tall before the judge, no longer hidden, no longer silenced. The journal letters and maps spoke louder than any rumor. Her father's deeds, her mother's records, even testimony from a former town clerk, all proved Ralston's guilt. The mayor was convicted of fraud, unlawful imprisonment, attempted murder, and corruption. As he was led away in chains, he turned to Clara with a twisted smile. "I'm not going alone," he muttered darkly. The words hung in the air like a curse, but the gavel came down, and the trial was done. Outside, the wind carried the first breath of spring. Clara stepped onto the courthouse steps, sunlight warming her face. Samuel waited at the bottom, his arm still bound, but standing tall. He offered his left hand. "You got your name back," he said softly. Clara's eyes glistened. "I didn't just get my name back, Samuel. I got my life." He smiled faintly. "You gave me mine, too." And in that moment, bruised but unbroken, they knew neither would ever walk alone again. The cabin on the ridge no longer sagged in shadows. Its roof had been rebuilt, its windows polished, its hearth warm. What once smelled of mildew and silence now carried the scent of lilacs that Clara had planted by the orchard, her mother's favorite. The land bore a new sign carved in oak by Samuel's hand: the Whitmore home for women who deserved to be heard, not hidden. Clara had not rebuilt it for herself alone. The home became a refuge, a place where women from across the valley came, some with bruises, some with nothing but the clothes on their backs, some carrying stories too painful to speak. They came quietly, often at night, but they left stronger. Samuel kept to his forge just beyond the orchard, the ringing of hammer on steel echoing down the valley each morning. His workshop stood as steady as the man himself, reliable and unyielding. But when dusk fell, his eyes always turned toward the cabin where Clara lit lanterns in the windows, so no soul would ever again feel lost in the dark. Inside, Clara worked in small, steady rhythms. She kept the books, brewed tea-folded linens. More importantly, she listened. When a woman cried, Clara did not demand explanations. She only sat close, offered warmth, and whispered, "You're not alone." At times, memories clawed at her. Nights when chains rattled in dreams, when she awoke with her hands clutched around her own wrists. But she no longer faced them alone. Samuel was always near, his presence steady as an anvil, his silence more comforting than any words. One afternoon, while Clara folded linens on the porch, a small voice broke the air. "Excuse me, miss." Clara turned. A girl, no older than 6, stood barefoot in the dust, clutching a ragged doll. Her hair hung in messy braids, her eyes too solemn for her age. "I had a mama," the girl said softly. "She's gone now." Clara's throat tightened. She knelt, setting the linens aside. "I'm sorry, sweetheart. Would you like to stay here a while?" The girl nodded, then hesitated. Can I call you Mama, too?" For a moment, Clara couldn't breathe. Tears welled, but she smiled gently and opened her arms. The child stepped into them, and Clara held her like her own soul had returned home. Silent tears slid down her cheeks as she whispered, "Yes, you can." Across the yard, Samuel stood at the forge, hammer paused mid-swing. He watched his face unreadable. But that night, when Clara rocked the child to sleep by the hearth, Samuel pulled out his carving knife. On the doorframe of the cabin above the latch, he etched a single name, Clara Whitmore. Not as property, as legacy, as home. Seasons shifted, and the home grew. Women arrived with stories of flight, of cruel husbands, of lost families, of towns that turned their faces away. Samuel built extra bunks in the loft, and Clara kept the kettle hot. Each woman who left did so with straighter shoulders, a little more light in her eyes. One spring morning, a rider appeared at the gate. He was a stranger in a long duster coat, his face hidden by a wide-brimmed hat. He dismounted slowly and approached Clara, who was sweeping the porch. "Ma'am," he said, removing his hat with respect, "I heard stories. Clara's hands tightened on the broom. What kind of stories? That this place was cursed. That a woman was locked up here shackled like an animal. The stranger's eyes traveled across the porch, the wooden swing Samuel had built the open door spilling laughter from within the fresh flowers blooming by the steps. Clara's lips curved into a steady smile. No, she said, voice calm but firm. This isn't where she was imprisoned. This is where she was finally free. The stranger blinked, nodded once, and stepped back. Whatever story he had expected, this was not it. Clara often thought of that night in the courthouse the moment Samuel had thrown himself between her and Ralston's bullet. She thought of the words Ralston had spat as they dragged him away. I'm not going alone. For a time, she feared his threat might come true. She feared shadows in every tree line, hoofbeats in every gust of wind. But Samuel had taught her something that fear loses its power when met with courage and when shared. And courage, she learned, didn't always roar. Sometimes it was quiet as a blacksmith's steady hand, gentle as the passing of a cup of water. Together, they had built more than a cabin. They had built a sanctuary forged from pain, but tempered with compassion. Years later, when people spoke of Duskwood, they no longer whispered of curses or vanished brides. They spoke of the Whitmore home, of the woman who had once been silenced but rose again to give voice to others, of the blacksmith who stood beside her asking for nothing but given everything, and those who stayed there, whether for a night or a year, carried the truth when they left that even the darkest prisons can be turned into sanctuaries when compassion is stronger than cruelty, and when justice is not just written in law, but lived in action. The story of Samuel Holt and Clara Whitmore is more than a tale of survival. It is a reminder that healing takes both strength and gentleness, that silence can be broken, and that every scar carries the possibility of transformation. Clara once believed she had been erased, but she reclaimed her name, her legacy, and her life. Samuel never asked for thanks yet. By his quiet loyalty, he became the guardian of a hope greater than himself. And in the end, the cabin bought for 50 cents became priceless, not for its land, but for the lives it sheltered, for the futures it rebuilt, for the truth it refused to bury. If this story moved, you share what it means to you in the comments. And if you believe that love, courage, and compassion can change the world, even in the smallest of places, then subscribe for more stories of redemption beneath the wide American sky. Because no matter how dark the night, there is always light waiting to be kindled.